A common impression that I hear about the French Revolution was that it was a conflict of the poor against the rich, which is true, but there's a bit more nuance to that class struggle. Class in the French Revolution was a bit different from how you might think of class today, and the French Revolution itself was instrumental in bringing about that shift in perspective. For example, you might think of the upper class today as some super rich guy like Mark Zuckerberg or Warren Buffett, and this is a distinction made almost purely due to their very large bank accounts, as opposed to them being like the descendant of so and so who was knighted by Charlemagne in the year 802. During the time of the French Revolution, the main instigators were the members of the Third Estate, which comprised of everyone not in the First or Second Estate, that is, the people who are not members of the Roman Catholic clergy and who are not the traditional landed nobility, so the size of their bank account didn't determine their social class, with the caveat that by the 18th century you could technically buy a noble office if you had enough money, but the long standing nobles resented this practice, the so called nobility of the sword, and this led to additional conflict between the second and third estates. So, what I find interesting about the third estate is that there was a lot of wealth diversity. The overwhelming majority, that is, let's say like 90% plus of the French population and thus the third estate, were peasants who lived in the countryside. In the cities, however, you would find the bourgeois, who were often quite wealthy citizen members of the third estate. Um, and these were usually some sort of merchants or businessmen, but they could also be artisans or lawyers or any number of roles that didn't confine them to essentially working the fields with their hand. This group often never had to worry about the price of bread that the peasants were so obsessed with, and collectively they owned almost a fifth of all French private wealth. But despite their riches, if they were in the third estate, then they were subject to the unfair tax and court treatment of the peasants as well, and many of the bourgeois resented that they had less rights than the so called nobles who lived solely off of inherited land and had no shred of business acumen. Nevertheless, many in this class of people decided to side with their fellow peasants in the Third Estate, who they probably actually had less in common with in terms of lifestyle than the nobles, who they would often intermingle with at social gatherings or during business deals. Just to be clear, I don't mean to imply that the Third Estate was divided into only the bourgeois and the peasants. There were the working urban poor, often called the sans-culottes, and what we today might consider actual middle class, those that were mostly comfortable most of the time. Karl Marx also referred to the French Revolution as a bourgeois revolution. In the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, he writes, Camille, Desmoulins, Danton, Robespierre, Saint Just, Napoleon, the heroes as well as the parties and the masses of the French Revolution, performed the task of their time, that of unchaining and establishing modern bourgeois society in Roman costumes and with Roman phrases. Later on in the piece, he goes to refers to the 18th century French revolutions as follows. Bourgeois revolutions, like those of the 18th century, storm more swiftly from success to success. Their dramatic effects outdo each other. Men and things seem set in sparkling diamonds. Ecstasy is the order of the day, but they are short lived. Soon they have reached their zenith, and a long katzenjammer takes hold of society before it learns to assimilate the results of its storm and stress period soberly. So that was a lot of additional words about the revolution. Marx tended to be quite the wordy writer, and he focused a lot on the bourgeois in particular. However, this is not to discount the efforts of the non-bourgeois in the Third Estate, whose muscle power, due to their sheer number in uprisings like the storming of Bastille or all of the various countryside revolts, was instrumental in solidifying the intellectual complaints of the bourgeois. How much of the victory belongs to the rich Third Estate and how much belongs to the poor peasants of the Third Estate during the French revolutions is almost impossible to say, and this will probably just depend on the specific question you're asking. But ultimately, both the rich and poor members of the Third Estate were able to bring about the beginning of the end For the European nobility and the traditional European class structure, and the start of our modern class structure and how we think about class today, at least in the West, where a penchant for turning a profit is king, where in America we worship the self made man and turn our noses up at the snobbishness of inherited wealth. Whether this is better or worse than the feudalistic system it replaced is also hard to say, so you can decide which one you like better. But one takeaway I have is that what divides us today may not be what divides us tomorrow.